Calvin sat quietly in the luxurious first-class cabin of Flight 237, his small frame dwarfed by the opulence surrounding him. The flight attendant, Lydia, approached with a hardened expression and a tone that brooked no argument. "Excuse me, young man, you don't belong here," she declared sharply as she loomed over him. Calvin looked up with wide, confused eyes, clutching his well-worn backpack a little tighter as he tried to explain that the seat was indeed his. Yet Lydia's suspicion was immediate and unyielding, and in that moment, the seeds of a harsh and unjust conflict were sown. Within mere minutes, Lydia's determination to enforce her interpretation of protocol escalated into an act of public humiliation. In front of a cabin full of attentive passengers, each whispering uneasily and casting sidelong glances, Calvin was forcefully escorted out of the first-class section. The sting of embarrassment cut deep as he was herded into the main cabin, leaving him isolated and utterly alone in a sea of indifferent faces. Although Calvin's ticket was genuine, his appearance, marked by a simple hoodie and jeans, set him apart from the usual refined first-class traveler. His eyes, filled with a mixture of hope and nervous apprehension, pleaded silently for understanding, yet none came. Little did anyone know that Calvin was not an ordinary passenger. He was the grandson of James Harrington, the billionaire owner of the Airline and a man whose influence stretched far beyond the confines of any aircraft. The irony was bitter. Here was a child about to experience his first solo flight and the long-awaited reunion with a grandfather he had only heard about in revered stories, only to be met with cruelty and disdain by someone entrusted with his care. As Lydia's harsh words rang out and her actions unfolded without mercy, Calvin's heart sank. He had dreamed of the moment he would finally meet his grandfather, imagining a warm embrace and a world of possibility. But instead, he was thrust into a nightmare of rejection and humiliation. Calvin's journey had promised excitement and wonder, yet the unfolding drama replaced anticipation with dread. The stern flight attendant's actions were not driven solely by a desire to uphold rules, but by a personal intolerance that seemed to border on cruelty. Lydia's eyes, cold and unyielding, belied a rigid mindset that placed protocol above compassion. Even as she demanded to see his boarding pass, her tone was laced with a subtle yet unmistakable malice, as though she relished the power she wielded over the young boy. Her scrutiny was relentless, and every slight gesture, from a furrowed brow to a dismissive tap of her pen, served as a reminder that Calvin was being judged not only for breaking an unwritten rule, but for not fitting into the polished image of first class. As Calvin timidly produced his boarding pass, his hands trembling ever so slightly, Lydia's eyes scanned the document with disbelief. "First class," she murmured, more to herself than to him, as if the sight of his valid ticket somehow confirmed her prejudiced assumptions rather than refuting them. "Are you sure this is correct?" she asked in a tone that offered no comfort or explanation. Calvin, his voice barely rising above a whisper, affirmed that the ticket was indeed legitimate, yet Lydia remained unmoved, her expression darkening into one of implacable resolve. "Please wait here," she ordered coldly, before striding away toward the galley, her posture exuding authority and contempt in equal measure. Calvin's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her retreat, each step echoing the finality of his demotion from first class to the cramped confines of the main cabin. The once inviting atmosphere of the first-class cabin was replaced by a stifling silence punctuated only by the murmurs of judgment from nearby passengers. Their eyes, filled with a mix of pity and disapproval, bore into him, amplifying his sense of isolation and deepening his feeling of not belonging. With every reluctant step down the aisle, he felt his dreams shatter a little more. Each whispered comment and sidelong glance a stark reminder of his undeserved punishment. In the main cabin, Calvin was forced to occupy a seat in the middle row, a stark contrast to the spacious comfort he had briefly experienced. The loss was palpable. The plush surroundings and generous legroom of first class had been replaced by cramped seats and a cold, impersonal environment. Here, the silence was not one of serenity, but of condemnation. Each passing minute seemed to stretch into an eternity of sorrow as Calvin struggled to quell the tears that threatened to spill over. The humiliation was not just a momentary lapse in decorum, but an event that cut into his very soul, leaving him to question why the world could be so harsh to someone so innocent. Meanwhile, Lydia returned to the galley, her mind awash with a growing unease. Although she had carried out her duty with unwavering firmness, a nagging feeling of regret began to claw at her. Deep down, she knew that her actions were more severe than necessary. Rather than offering a kind explanation or a genuine apology, she had chosen the path of strict adherence to rules, a path that left behind a trail of wounded emotions. Her rigid commitment to protocol had blinded her to the human cost of her actions, and now, the weight of that oversight pressed heavily on her conscience. The situation took an even darker turn when Lydia's phone rang, shattering the already fragile calm. A voice from the executive team, firm and unyielding, informed her that Calvin was, in fact, the grandson of none other than James Harrington. The revelation hit her like a bolt of lightning, and for a moment, the veneer of authority crumbled to reveal the depth of her error. Her heart pounded with a mix of panic and regret as she realized that she had not only humiliated an innocent child, but had also jeopardized the comfort of one of the most influential families in the airline. The gravity of her mistake was overwhelming, yet instead of taking immediate steps to mend the situation with genuine remorse, Lydia's internal conflict only deepened. She was trapped between a desire to correct her misdeed and a stubborn insistence on following the rigid policies that had led her to this moment. Back in the main cabin, Calvin's small world had been upended. The promising excitement of a journey filled with new experiences had been replaced by the searing pain of exclusion and injustice. Each whisper from the passengers, each cold glance, compounded the profound sense of isolation he felt. In his young heart, the dream of meeting his grandfather was now tainted by the bitter taste of humiliation. He wondered with a growing sense of dread how his revered grandfather would react to learning that his grandson had been treated with such callous disregard. Would the man known for his power and influence be moved to anger, or would he offer the compassion that Calvin so desperately needed? As the flight continued, the cabin's atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The once cheerful hum of announcements and the soft murmur of conversation were now drowned out by the heavy silence of judgment and regret. Calvin's eyes wandered to the window, where the vast expanse of blue sky and drifting clouds offered a stark contrast to the cramped, confining space in which he now sat. Each cloud seemed to whisper a silent lament for the innocents lost in the wake of cruelty, a poignant reminder that even in the skies, where one expects safety and comfort, harsh realities can prevail. Lydia's inner turmoil, too, intensified with every passing minute. Despite her earlier conviction, she could no longer ignore the growing chasm between duty and decency. The call from her superiors had forced her to confront the consequences of her actions, a public spectacle of punishment that could not easily be erased. Every time she glanced back toward the main cabin, where Calvin's sorrowful eyes met hers from across the aisle, a pang of regret pierced her heart. The rigid adherence to rules that had once given her a sense of order now felt like a heavy shackle, binding her to a course of action that had inflicted irreparable harm. In the final moments before landing, as the plane began its slow descent, the tension in the cabin reached its peak. Calvin sat in silence, a quiet resignation settling over him as he braced himself for the inevitable confrontation with his future. His thoughts were a swirling mix of hope and despair, hope that his grandfather might offer some comfort, and despair at the injustice he had suffered. Each second ticked by with agonizing slowness, as if the very air around him were thick with the weight of his. As the cabin doors prepared to open and the promise of solid ground loomed ahead, a heavy stillness prevailed. Lydia, still reeling from the implications of her mistake, could do nothing but stand in a state of internal conflict, torn between the desire to rectify her error and the unyielding rigidity of the rules that had led her to this moment. Calvin, though still trembling from the ordeal, clung to a fragile hope that somewhere, in the warmth of a genuine human connection, he might finally be seen and understood. His journey had become a profound lesson in the cruelty that can arise from the blind enforcement of protocol, a lesson that left him both wounded and wiser in the harsh realities of a world that often values appearances over empathy. In that final, somber moment as the passengers began to disembark, the echoes of the day's events lingered in the air. The memory of a young boy unjustly removed from the comfort of first class, and the relentless, unforgiving cruelty of a flight attendant haunted everyone present. For those who listened to this tale, there emerged a deep-seated empathy and a call to cherish kindness over cold conformity. A reminder that even in moments of profound injustice, the human spirit still yearns for compassion and understanding. Calvin sat there in the quiet of the cabin as the airplane's wheels kissed the tarmac, his heart still heavy from the sting of humiliation he had suffered only moments before. He trusted deep down that his grandfather, a man known for his fairness and unyielding sense of honor, would ensure that this blatant injustice would not be swept under the rug. Even though the memory of being forcefully removed from first class still burned inside him, Calvin clung to the hope that his influential grandfather would soon come to his rescue and right the wrong that had been done. As the plane touched down smoothly, Calvin remained in his seat by the window, his eyes fixed on the world outside, while his mind raced with both exhaustion and quiet determination. Every fiber of his being longed for comfort, yet he could not allow the embarrassment of the moment to overwhelm him. He knew that someone important would soon be there to stand by him. Back inside the cabin, Lydia was struggling to come to terms with the full magnitude of her mistake. Earlier, she had believed she was simply enforcing the rules, but now the realization that the young boy she had so harshly mistreated was none other than a member of the powerful Harrington family pressed down on her like an unyielding weight. As she hurried through the narrow confines of the galley, her mind swirled with regret and mounting panic. She had tried to dismiss the incident as a mere seating mix-up, but now every whispered comment from the passengers and every furtive glance cast in her direction confirmed that her error was far from trivial. The boy she had unceremoniously ejected from first class had a name that carried weight. Calvin was not just any passenger, but the grandson of James Harrington, a titan in the airline industry. The gravity of her misjudgment, which was rooted in a superficial assessment of his appearance and modest clothing, now threatened to shatter her professional composure. As the cabin buzzed with the sound of passengers preparing to disembark, the atmosphere felt charged with a silent tension that could not be ignored. Calvin, sitting quietly with his small hands gripping his backpack, tried to steady his racing thoughts as he watched the scene unfold. He felt as if he were detached from his own life, an observer in a nightmare that he could neither control nor escape. Every time he glanced at his phone, his heart pounded with anxious hope, waiting for a reassuring message from his grandfather. Then, just as the moment of despair began to set in, a soft buzz from his phone broke the silence. It was a message from his grandfather's assistant, confirming the details of his arrival at the terminal. The brief note read, "We'll be waiting for you at the gate. Don't worry, everything's taken care of." Although this message provided a small measure of comfort, it was quickly eclipsed by a fresh wave of anxiety. Calvin couldn't help but wonder how his stern yet caring grandfather would react to the humiliating ordeal he had just experienced. Would his grandfather be angry at the injustice inflicted on him? Would he consider Calvin responsible for causing trouble? Despite the uncertainty, Calvin took a deep breath and tried to reassure himself that he was not alone, that the strength of his family's legacy would soon shine through. Lydia, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly aware that her actions had triggered a chain reaction that she could neither control nor undo. As the truth of the situation spread like wildfire through the cabin and beyond, passengers began to exchange worried looks and soft whispers. It was not long before the ripple effect reached every corner of the flight. and even the crew found themselves under the weight of collective judgment. Each glance, each murmur was a reminder that what had initially seemed like a minor procedural error had blossomed into a scandal of epic proportions. The realization that she had publicly shamed a boy connected to one of the richest and most respected families in the airline industry filled Lydia with a deep, gnawing dread. In her hurried steps down the aisle, she could feel the eyes of everyone on her. Some passengers stared with obvious disapproval, while others engaged in hushed conversations that spoke volumes of their silent condemnation. There was no escaping the truth now. Calvin was not merely a child in the wrong seat, but the scion of a family whose influence reached far and wide. When the captain's voice came over the intercom, his tone calm yet stern, it did little to ease the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just landed. Please remain seated as we complete a few necessary procedures. I will keep you informed of the situation," he announced. The unusual formality in his words sent a shiver down Lydia's spine. It was as if even the captain recognized that something extraordinary and far more serious than a simple seating error had taken place. Moments later, Lydia's phone rang again, and with trembling hands, she answered. The voice on the other end delivered news that left her stomach twisting in knots. "Lydia, we've received word that Mr. Harrington is aware of the incident. His team is already in contact with the airline's executive office. You need to handle this delicately. We will be taking full responsibility for this mistake, and it needs to be rectified immediately." Those words confirmed that the stakes had risen dramatically. This was no longer just about a misplaced seat. It was about corporate reputation, accountability, and the high standards expected of an airline that prided itself on excellence. The gravity of the situation bore down on Lydia as the airplane slowly made its way toward the gate. Calvin, who had been silently absorbing every detail of the unfolding drama, now sat with a quiet resolve. He knew that the conversation he was about to have would be difficult, yet the thought that his grandfather was on his side provided him with a surge of strength. As the aircraft finally came to a stop, the usual buzz of passengers preparing to disembark filled the terminal. Yet for Calvin there was no trace of excitement or relief, only a heavy, lingering uncertainty about what lay ahead. His gaze shifted from the flight attendants, who were now moving with an air of awkwardness and discomfort, to the entrance of the terminal where his future awaited him. He could see that while some crew members tried to maintain their routine, others appeared visibly shaken by the events that had transpired. In the midst of this palpable tension, Calvin's thoughts remained steadfastly focused on his grandfather. He trusted that James Harrington, the powerful owner of the airline, would not let this cruelty slide. As the seconds ticked by, anxiety continued to gnaw at his heart, yet a quiet strength began to take shape within him. Across the cabin, Lydia struggled to regain a semblance of control. Though she moved down the aisle with far professionalism, her mind was far from composed. Every step she took was heavy with regret, and each furtive glance from the passengers only deepened her internal turmoil. She knew that nothing could undo the damage already done, yet she still clung to the hope of salvaging even a shred of her dignity. As Calvin slowly gathered his things and stood up, a hush fell over the cabin. Some passengers offered apologetic glances, while others looked on with a mix of curiosity and silent judgment. Calvin walked deliberately toward the front where the flight attendants were stationed. Lydia, who had been trying to muster the courage to speak, stiffened at the sight of him approaching. In that moment, the room seemed to close in on her, as every pair of eyes focused on the confrontation that was inevitable. She took a hesitant step forward, her voice quivering as she attempted to speak. "Calvin, I'm sorry for the misunderstanding earlier. I didn't know who you were," she managed to say, her tone fraught with both apology and desperation, yet her words fell flat against the enormity of her mistake. Calvin, with a calm yet distant expression on his face, replied quietly, "I'm fine. I'll wait for my grandfather." His measured response, filled with a maturity beyond his years, cut through the tension like a cold breeze. Lydia's face flushed with embarrassment as she quickly stepped aside, knowing full well that her apology could never mend the pain she had caused. She realized then that this was not a mistake that would fade into obscurity. It was an error that would haunt her for a long time to come. With a final heavy sigh, Calvin stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal. His footsteps were steady, though his heart pounded with apprehension. Every step he took was a reminder of the cruel treatment he had endured, yet also a silent vow that he would not be broken by it. As he moved through the terminal, the ambient noise of rolling suitcases and distant conversations seemed to fade away, replaced by the steady cadence of his own resolve. Calvin knew that his grandfather, a man who had built his reputation on fairness and respect, would not allow such blatant cruelty to go unchallenged. The thought of facing his grandfather stirred a quiet, determined strength within him. He was not just a victim of an unfortunate seating mix-up. He was a young man whose dignity had been trampled upon by an unyielding and callous authority. As he waited for further instructions, Calvin's mind replayed the events of the flight like a broken record. Every moment of his mistreatment, the cold dismissal, the humiliating transfer from first class, the silent judgmental stares of the passengers resurfaced with painful clarity. And yet, amid the sorrow and confusion, a small ember of hope burned steadily. That hope was fueled by the promise that his influential family would soon intervene, that the wrongs committed against him would be acknowledged and rectified. For Calvin, this was not just an isolated incident, but a turning point that would redefine his understanding of justice and compassion. In that charged moment at the terminal, as the familiar hum of airport activity continued around him, Calvin felt an inner strength solidify. The injustice he had suffered, the cruelty of a woman who had lost her way in rigid adherence to rules, and the silence of a disapproving audience had all converged into a single defining experience. He knew that his grandfather, James Harrington, would not stand idly by while such cruelty went unchallenged. He nodded, and with that unwavering certainty, Calvin stepped forward into an uncertain future, determined to reclaim his dignity and show the world that even in moments of profound injustice, the human spirit could find the strength to rise again. Calvin felt the weight of the day settle over him as he realized he was now at the center of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The usual hustle of families reuniting, the steady clatter of rolling suitcases, and the soft chatter of travelers all seemed to fade into the background, as though everyone in the terminal instinctively knew that a momentous event had just occurred. Standing at the airplane's doorway, Lydia lingered in a state of shock. For so long she had prided herself on following the rules and performing her duties with an unwavering sense of duty, but now, watching Calvin stride toward the gate with a quiet determination, she felt small and utterly exposed. The guilt that had been gnawing at her throughout the flight now clung to her like a heavy, suffocating cloak, and she could do nothing but stand rooted in place as Calvin moved forward. Calvin's every step toward the terminal carried the echoes of the harsh treatment he had endured. Even though his heart was still aching from being unjustly removed from first class, he found solace in the knowledge that his influential grandfather would soon be there to stand up for him. As he passed through the glass doors, his phone vibrated softly in his pocket. A reassuring message from his grandfather's assistant appeared on the screen. "We're ready for you. Don't worry, everything's in motion." Those few words, simple yet profound, sparked a tiny flame of relief within him, momentarily easing the sting of humiliation. However, the unease from earlier still lingered in his mind like a dark cloud, and as he walked further into the bustling terminal, every sound and every glance seemed to remind him of the cruelty he had just experienced. At the baggage claim area, Calvin's eyes were drawn to a group of executives standing in neat formation. They were dressed in crisp business suits, their expressions a mixture of concern and uncertainty. Their whispered conversations and exchanged glances spoke volumes. It was clear that news of the incident had spread quickly and was being taken very seriously. In the midst of this tense atmosphere, one figure stepped forward. A tall, commanding man whose presence exuded an unmistakable air of authority and calm. Calvin recognized him immediately as James Harrington, his grandfather, whose reputation for fairness and unyielding integrity was as renowned as his business acumen. James approached Calvin with a demeanor that was both stern and reassuring. His eyes, sharp and calculating yet softened by genuine care, met Calvin's gaze, and he said in a warm, measured tone, "Calvin, I'm glad you're okay." With that, James pulled Calvin into a firm, comforting hug that seemed to momentarily wash away the day's pain. For a few brief moments, Calvin allowed himself to relax into his grandfather's embrace, feeling a deep sense of protection that made him forget, if only for a while, the cruelty he had suffered. Pulling back, Calvin looked up at his grandfather, his voice trembling as he asked, "Grandfather, what happened? Why did they treat me so terribly? Why did Lydia do those things?" His words were soft, laden with both confusion and heartbreak, as he sought answers to an ordeal he could hardly comprehend. James's expression grew grave as he turned to face the group of executives standing nearby. "There is much we need to discuss, Calvin," he said in a low, resolute voice. "But first, you must know that what happened today was a terrible mistake. A mistake that will not be tolerated. We are going to ensure that this injustice is corrected and that it never happens again." Although Calvin nodded silently, trying to absorb every word, the weight of the situation pressed down on him, and he could feel a surge of anger mixed with sorrow bubbling inside. The incident was no longer just about a simple seating error. It had grown into a matter of corporate reputation and a systemic failure of empathy. The executives around them exchanged hushed words as one stepped forward to address the situation. "You will be receiving a full report," he said gravely. "We have already contacted the CEO and initiated an internal review. This issue will be handled immediately." Even as these formalities were discussed, James's eyes remained fixed on Calvin, and his tone softened as he continued. "Calvin, you don't need to worry about any of this. I promise you. We are going to fix this, not just for you, but to ensure that no one else is ever treated in such a cruel and dismissive way." His words carried the weight of authority and the warmth of genuine concern, and for the first time that day, Calvin felt a spark of hope amid the darkness. As the group began to move toward the exit, James placed a steady hand on Calvin's shoulder and said, "We are going to make sure that this is the last time something like this ever happens. Trust me." The reassurance in his grandfather's voice, firm and gentle, began to lift the heavy burden in Calvin's chest. Although the ordeal was not entirely over, he was no longer alone. Standing with his grandfather and the supportive team around him, Calvin felt a newfound strength growing within him, a resolve to overcome the injustice and to stand up not only for himself, but for everyone who might one day face similar cruelty. Outside, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. The crisp American air, cool and invigorating, greeted them as they stepped out of the terminal. James walked with purposeful strides, his long steps and confident posture a clear sign that he was a man not to be trifled with. Calvin, walking beside him, absorbed every bit of that silent strength, feeling it seep into his own spirit. They reached a waiting car parked conveniently near the terminal, and as they climbed in, James turned to Calvin with a serious yet compassionate expression. "Calvin," he said, "you do not need to worry about any of this right now. What happened today was deeply wrong, and I will make sure that those responsible are held accountable. But for now, I want you to focus on being with your family. This is what truly matters." Calvin managed a faint smile, though the memories of the day's humiliation still stung. The promise of safety and respect from his grandfather was a balm to his wounded heart. As the car drove away from the airport, the city lights began to twinkle like stars scattered across a deep, dark sky. Calvin's thoughts drifted back to the harsh moments on the plane. He remembered every detail with painful clarity. The dismissive tone in Lydia's voice, the way she had treated him as if he were an intruder in a place where he did not belong, and the overwhelming isolation he had felt when he was forced into the cramped, uncomfortable seats of the main cabin. Every whispered comment from fellow passengers, every sidelong glance had added to his sense of despair. Yet, even amid these painful recollections, the warmth of his grandfather's words and the firm promise of justice offered him a ray of hope. In the days and weeks that followed, the incident became a catalyst for sweeping changes within the airline. James Harrington, a man of remarkable influence and unwavering principles, took decisive action. He convened meetings with top executives and made it clear that the treatment Calvin had suffered was not only unacceptable, but also a symptom of a broader issue, an issue of bias and cruelty that needed to be eradicated from the company's culture. "This must never happen again," James declared, in a boardroom filled with attentive faces. "We will implement new training programs for all our staff, including flight attendants, to ensure that every passenger is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve." His words resonated with authority, and it was evident that his resolve to bring about meaningful change was unyielding. Calvin's painful experience, though deeply personal, soon became a symbol of the need for reform. His story was shared quietly among airline employees and eventually reached the wider public through news outlets and social media. Each retelling of his ordeal amplified the call for a more compassionate, inclusive approach to customer service. Yet, despite the public outcry and the sweeping changes being instituted, Calvin's personal scars remained. The memory of that day, the cold, hard dismissal by Lydia, the crushing isolation, and the overwhelming sense of being judged solely by his appearance would stay with him for a long time. Each recollection was a stark reminder of the cruelty that can lurk behind even the most seemingly ordinary interactions. For Lydia, the consequences of her actions were immediate and severe. Once a flight attendant known for her strict adherence to procedure, she now found herself under intense scrutiny. The harsh criticism from her superiors and the public forced her to confront the fact that her rigid insistence on following outdated protocols had blinded her to the human element of her job. In the quiet hours after the incident, Lydia began a painful process of self-reflection. She realized that her actions had not only hurt Calvin, but had also contributed to a culture of bias and indifference that could no longer be tolerated. In subsequent training sessions, designed to address issues of customer care and cultural sensitivity, Lydia struggled to come to terms with the damage she had caused. Though she tried to offer apologies and explain that she had merely been following protocol, her words rang hollow in the face of the deep emotional wounds inflicted on a young boy. Over time, Lydia's transformation became apparent. She began to speak openly about the need for empathy in the service industry, using her own experience as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind obedience to rules without compassion. However, the road to redemption was long and fraught with challenges, and the memory of that fateful flight continued to haunt her. Back at home in his grandfather's stately yet welcoming residence, a reflection of understated American luxury, Calvin started to find solace in the supportive environment that surrounded him. The house, decorated in a tasteful blend of classic and modern American styles, was a sanctuary away from the harsh realities of the world. Here, in the gentle glow of soft lighting and the quiet hum of familial love, Calvin began to heal. His grandfather would often sit with him in the cozy living room, sharing stories of his own struggles and triumphs, and reassuring him that every challenge could be overcome with strength, dignity, and the support of those who truly cared. James would say, "Today was a terrible day, but it is also a reminder that we must always stand up for what is right. Your experience has sparked a movement within our company, a movement that will ensure that no one is ever made to feel as insignificant as you did today." These heartfelt words resonated deeply with Calvin, reinforcing his belief that his pain had not been in vain. In the days that followed, as the airline began implementing sweeping reforms, Calvin found himself at the center of discussions about fairness, empathy, and the need for systemic change. He was invited to share his story at community meetings and industry conferences, where his poignant account of mistreatment and subsequent redemption inspired many. His speeches, delivered in a gentle, measured tone that resonated with an audience that included many older Americans, particularly women who had seen their share of life's hardships, were filled with quiet determination and heartfelt sincerity. "We must never allow prejudice to dictate how we treat one another," he would say softly, his voice steady despite the lingering echoes of his "Every person deserves kindness. Every individual deserves respect. And together, we can build a world where compassion triumphs over cruelty." His words, simple yet powerful, touched the hearts of those who listened, reminding them that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope for a better tomorrow. As the weeks turned into months, the memory of that awful day gradually transformed from a source of shame and sorrow into a catalyst for change. The new training programs and revised customer service protocols within the airline began to bear fruit, and a culture of inclusivity and respect started to take root. Employees, from flight attendants to ground staff, were encouraged to see each passenger not merely as a number or a potential liability, but as a human being with unique needs and inherent dignity. Calvin observed these changes with cautious optimism, knowing that the road to a truly compassionate service industry would be long, but hopeful that his experience had paved the way for future improvements. One evening, as Calvin sat quietly in the elegant dining room of his grandfather's home, the soft murmur of a piano playing in the background, he reflected on the transformative journey he had been through. The polished silverware and glistening crystal in the room were symbols of a world that valued refinement and respect. And yet Calvin knew that true luxury was not found in material possessions, but in the simple act of treating every person with kindness. "I never imagined that a day that began with such pain could lead to such hope," he confided quietly to his grandfather one night. James, sitting across from him with a gentle smile, replied, "Calvin, sometimes our most difficult moments open our eyes to the possibilities of change. Your strength in the face of injustice has shown us all what it means to stand up for what is right." In that moment, Calvin felt a deep sense of purpose. He understood that his painful experience was not just an isolated incident, but a spark that ignited a broader movement against cruelty and discrimination. With each passing day, as the reforms took hold and the airline began to transform its culture, Calvin's resolve grew stronger. He made a promise to himself that he would continue to advocate for fairness and inclusivity, using his voice to challenge any form of bias he encountered. His journey had been long and arduous, filled with moments of deep sorrow and fleeting hope, but through it all he emerged not as a victim, but as a beacon of change. Standing on the threshold of a new chapter in his life, Calvin realized that the experiences of the past had equipped him with a wisdom beyond his years. The injustices he had suffered, though painful, had forged within him an unbreakable spirit, a spirit that would never allow cruelty to go unchallenged. As he looked out the window of his grandfather's home at the sprawling American landscape with its familiar mix of bustling city lights and quiet suburban streets, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The journey had taught him that even in the face of deep-seated prejudice, the human heart is capable of incredible resilience and transformation. Calvin's story, once marred by the callous actions of a single flight attendant, had grown into a powerful narrative of redemption and hope. It was a story that resonated deeply with people from all walks of life, particularly with those who had witnessed or experienced similar injustices. His gentle yet firm advocacy for change, his willingness to speak out against bias, and his unwavering belief in the power of family and community made him a symbol of perseverance. And though the memories of that fateful flight would always remain a part of him, they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as a reminder that from even the darkest moments, a brighter future could emerge. As the night deepened and the gentle hum of the city lulled the world into a peaceful rhythm, Calvin sat quietly, his thoughts mingling with the soft strains of the piano in the background. He knew that the battle for justice was far from over, that there were still many who would suffer from the cruelty of prejudice. Yet, he also knew that every step taken toward reform was a step toward a more compassionate society. With his grandfather's steady guidance and the support of a growing community dedicated to change, Calvin was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. In that quiet, reflective moment, he made a vow to himself that he would never again allow the cruelty of others to define his worth, and that he would always stand up for those who could not speak for themselves. And so, as the car pulled away from the airport that day, a day that began in pain and humiliation and ended in hope and renewal, Calvin looked ahead with eyes full of determination. His journey had not been easy, and the scars of that day would always be a part of him. But he knew that his story had the power to inspire change. With every word he spoke and every action he took, he would honor the promise of justice his grandfather had made. He would work tirelessly to ensure that kindness and respect would prevail over bias and cruelty, not just within the airline industry, but in every corner of society. In the soft glow of the early morning light, as the city began to stir and a new day dawned, Calvin felt a deep sense of resolve. The events of that day had transformed him, forged him into someone who would stand up against injustice with courage and compassion. And as he prepared to face the future, he carried with him the unshakable belief that together, with love, understanding, and a commitment to fairness, even the deepest wounds could be healed, and every wrong could be righted. Calvin's story is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that even in moments of profound cruelty, hope can be found and change is possible. His experience has sparked a movement, inspiring others to re-examine their own biases and to fight for a world where every person is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. And though the journey is far from over, Calvin now walks a path illuminated by the promise of a better, kinder tomorrow. A path that, with every step, brings him closer to a future where justice and compassion reign supreme. Calvin sat in the elegant dining room of his grandfather's home, where the soft glow of chandelier lights, polished silverware, and sparkling glasses created an atmosphere of understated American luxury. Yet, despite the refined surroundings, his mind could not escape the painful memories of the day. He remembered every detail from the flight, the sting of being singled out, judged, and humiliated by that unyielding flight attendant, Lydia. Her harsh treatment, based solely on the way he looked, had cut him deeply, leaving him feeling small and undeserving of the first-class experience he had rightfully earned. As he absent-mindedly stirred his drink, the memories of that moment clashed with the present, and he could almost hear her cold, dismissive tone echoing in his ears. Across the table, his grandfather James, a man whose calm authority and compassionate heart had always been his anchor, observed Calvin with gentle concern. James picked up his glass of wine and took a slow, deliberate sip before speaking in a steady, reassuring voice. "I know today hasn't been easy for you, Calvin, but I want you to know that none of this is your fault. What happened on that flight, what Lydia did to you, is entirely on her. You did nothing to deserve such treatment." His words, spoken with the kind of measured care that comes from decades of experience, were meant to soothe the raw hurt Calvin felt. Calvin looked up from his plate, meeting his grandfather's gaze, his voice trembling with lingering emotion. "But I didn't do anything wrong, Grandpa. Why did she treat me like that? Just because I don't look a certain way? It still feels so unjust." His eyes, filled with a mixture of sorrow and anger, sought answers in the gentle reassurance his grandfather offered. James leaned forward, his expression softening as he explained, "It's hard to understand, I know, but sometimes people make snap judgments based on appearances. Lydia saw you, and in her narrow view of who belongs in first class, you simply did not fit that mold. And that, my dear, was terribly wrong." His voice was firm yet kind, and in that moment the dinner table became a place of healing as much as it was a setting for reflection. The conversation slowly turned to the broader implications of the incident. "I'm not just upset for myself," Calvin admitted quietly. "What if other people, who don't have a grandfather like you to stand up for them, are treated this way?" What if they have no one to protect their dignity when someone like Lydia decides they're unworthy? His words resonated with a deep-seated fear that the injustice he had suffered might be a common occurrence for those less fortunate, a fear that now fueled his resolve for change. James's eyes hardened with determination as he replied, "That is exactly why we must ensure this never happens again. It isn't solely about you, Calvin. It's about every person who has ever been treated unfairly because of their appearance or background. We are going to hold this airline accountable, and we will fight for a system where respect and fairness are not just lofty ideals but everyday realities." His tone left no room for doubt. The battle for change was personal, and his authority was clear. Change would come, and it would start now. Later that evening, as the warm lights of the living room cast gentle shadows on the walls, James's phone buzzed with an email from the airline's legal team. Reading it quickly, his brow furrowed with the weight of its contents. An internal review had already been launched, and a formal statement was being prepared by the airline. Yet James knew that a mere apology or half-hearted promises would never be enough to repair the deep wounds inflicted by such blatant bias and cruelty. He believed that the changes needed to be profound and systematic, a complete overhaul of policies and attitudes that had allowed such mistreatment to occur. Calvin listened intently as his grandfather continued, his voice a blend of quiet authority and genuine compassion. "You see, Calvin, power is only useful when it's used to make things better for everyone. I have spent many years building relationships and using my influence to help others. And now, it is time to use that power to ensure that no one is ever made to feel as insignificant or unwelcome as you did today." There was a subtle fierceness in his words, a promise that the injustice Calvin experienced would not be swept under the rug, but would instead serve as a catalyst for real change. Calvin's heart swelled with a mix of pride and anxiety as he absorbed his grandfather's commitment. "You've got a lot of power, don't you, Grandpa?" he asked softly, still processing the enormity of the situation. James smiled warmly and replied, "Yes, but power means nothing if it isn't used for good. Today we are not just fighting for you. We are fighting for everyone who has ever been judged unfairly based on appearances. We are going to start a conversation that must be had, and we will push for change until every policy is rewritten and every staff member understands that every passenger deserves respect." The conversation lingered in Calvin's mind long after dinner. He couldn't help but replay the memory of Lydia's callous behavior, the way she had arrogantly dismissed him as if he were an inconvenience. That memory stoked the flames of conflict between him and the woman whose cruelty had shattered his sense of belonging. Even as the comforting tones of his grandfather's assurances filled the room, Calvin's thoughts were a tangle of hurt and a burgeoning determination to ensure that such prejudice would never be tolerated again. The next morning, Calvin awoke early, the soft light of dawn filtering through the window and casting a golden glow over the city. The memories of the previous day still stung, but as he watched the sunrise, he felt a quiet anticipation for what was to come. His grandfather was already preparing for a pivotal meeting with the airline's board of directors, a meeting that promised to be a turning point not just for him, but for the entire company. Downstairs, James dressed in a tailored suit, his demeanor calm and resolute. When he emerged into the living room, he asked gently, "Ready for today, Calvin?" Though Calvin's voice was uncertain as he replied, "What if they don't listen, Grandpa? What if they just offer a quick apology and nothing more?" James's smile was reassuring as he placed a steady hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Then we will make them listen. We will push harder and we will demand the changes that are so desperately needed. Real change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with us being willing to fight for what is right." Their car ride to the airline's headquarters was filled with a heavy, determined silence as the city rushed by. Arriving at the sleek, modern building, they were met by the somber faces of high-ranking executives and board members who had gathered in the lobby. James led Calvin through the glass doors, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Whispers and curious glances followed them as they made their way to the boardroom, where the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and the promise of accountability. Once inside, James took his seat at the head of the table and addressed the room with a calm yet unwavering tone. "Thank you all for coming. I am here today because of an incident that should never have happened. My grandson Calvin was treated with blatant unfairness on one of our flights yesterday. This was not a mere mistake. It was a profound failure of our company's values, a failure that reflects deeper issues within our organization." As he spoke, Calvin's eyes met those of the board members, and he felt the full weight of the injustice that had been visited upon him. James continued, his voice carrying the quiet resolve of a man determined to set things right. "We will be implementing mandatory training for all our employees. We must create a culture where respect and fairness are the very foundation of our operations. This is not just about one incident. It is about ensuring that no one, regardless of their appearance or background, is ever made to feel unworthy of the first-class treatment they deserve." His words, delivered with both authority and empathy, resonated in the silent boardroom. In that moment, Calvin felt a surge of pride. He was no longer just a victim of an unfortunate incident. He was part of a movement for real, lasting change. As the meeting drew to a close and the executives began to acknowledge their responsibility, Calvin realized that his painful experience had ignited a fire for justice that could transform not only the airline's culture, but also the broader society. With every word his grandfather spoke, the hope that had been kindled in him grew brighter. As the day progressed, Calvin and James stepped out of the boardroom into a future that, while uncertain, promised a renewed commitment to fairness and respect. The echoes of the past, of Lydia's callous disregard and the cruelty that had wounded him, would serve as a constant reminder of why this fight was so important. Calvin knew that change would not come easily, but with his grandfather's steadfast guidance and the support of those who believed in justice, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. In that quiet, determined moment, as the sunlight streamed through the windows of the headquarters and the promise of a new beginning filled the air, Calvin understood that his journey was far from over. Instead, it was just beginning. A journey defined not by the cruelty he had endured, but by the power of standing up for what is right, and by the unyielding hope that together they could build a more compassionate, just world. Calvin watched with a mix of awe and determination as his grandfather, James, led the board meeting with a calm yet unyielding force. The atmosphere in the conference room was thick with anticipation as James outlined a plan that would not only address the incident that had so cruelly affected Calvin, but also overhaul the entire culture of the airline. He announced that there would be a third-party audit of all customer-facing employees to ensure they adhered to the highest standards of respect and inclusivity. Every word was measured and deliberate, a promise that the days of callous treatment were over and that the company would be held accountable for its mistakes. Throughout the meeting, Calvin could not help but recall the painful memory of the flight. He remembered how Lydia, with her cold and unyielding demeanor, had treated him as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. Her cruel, biased behavior had left him feeling humiliated and undeserving, a deep injustice that had shattered his confidence. Now, as he sat in that boardroom, the lingering sting of that experience fueled his determination to see real change. The executives, who had long taken their roles for granted, now listened intently as James pushed for accountability. Some of them appeared visibly uneasy, while others exchanged glances that revealed both satisfaction and a newfound resolve. It was clear that the tide was turning, whether everyone was ready for it or not. James spoke passionately about the need for sweeping reforms. He explained that the incident involving Calvin was not just an isolated mistake by one employee, but symptomatic of a broader, systemic failure, a failure that allowed prejudice and bias to fester unchecked. He emphasized that the airline's reputation was built on respect for its customers, and that respect had to extend to every individual, regardless of their appearance or background. "We are not simply going to issue a quick apology and move on," he declared in a voice that resonated with authority. "We are here to change the very foundation of our company. We will be implementing mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all staff members, and we will conduct a thorough review of our policies to ensure that no one is ever made to feel as unwelcome as you were." His words stirred a murmur of agreement around the table, and Calvin felt a spark of hope ignite within him. As the meeting progressed, James methodically addressed each point on the agenda. He pushed for concrete actions rather than empty promises. He demanded that every department review its policies and work collectively to create a culture where every passenger was treated with the dignity they deserved. The room was charged with a sense of urgency as board members realized that this was about more than damage control. It was about setting a precedent for the future. Calvin listened intently, his heart swelling with pride as he saw his grandfather fearlessly championing the rights of not only himself, but of every person who had ever been the victim of discrimination. He recognized that this fight for change was personal, and that the courage to confront systemic injustice came with great responsibility. After the meeting, as the board members began to shake hands and disperse, Calvin stood and felt the weight of the moment settling in his bones. He recalled the harsh words and the cold, dismissive attitude of Lydia, the flight attendant whose actions had sparked this entire upheaval. Her behavior, rooted in a misguided adherence to outdated protocols, had not only caused him immense pain, but had also revealed a deep-seated cruelty that could no longer be tolerated. Her actions had ignited a fire that would force the entire company to reckon with its failures. As he left the boardroom, he felt a surge of determination mingled with the lingering pain, a powerful mix that spurred him to keep fighting for a better, more just environment for everyone. Outside the boardroom, the corridors were abuzz with conversation. Some employees wore expressions of curiosity, while others seemed respectfully subdued, aware that significant changes were afoot. The weight of his grandfather's influence was unmistakable, and it became clear that this was only the beginning. James had made his point, and now the challenge was to follow through. The commitment to change was not something that could be achieved overnight, but it was a battle that needed to be fought every single day. Calvin understood that true transformation required constant vigilance and a willingness to push even when progress seemed slow. The car ride back to their residence was much quieter than the one to the headquarters. Calvin sat gazing out the window, his mind churning with thoughts of the meeting and the promises made. His heart ached as he remembered how, not long ago, he had been reduced to a victim by a single act of unkindness, a mistake that had been emblematic of a broken system. Yet now, amid the quiet hum of the car engine and the soft passing of streetlights, he felt a profound shift. His grandfather's unwavering commitment to justice had not only restored his dignity, but had also given him a glimpse of a future where fairness and respect were more than just empty words. In the days that followed, the media frenzy surrounding the incident grew louder. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and the hashtag proclaiming that no one should be treated that way began to trend on social media. Calvin's mistreatment became a rallying cry for those who had suffered similar indignities, and public outrage forced the airline to take the issue seriously. The corporate headquarters was under intense scrutiny, and every move made by the company was dissected by the press. Yet through it all, James remained a pillar of strength. His press conferences were measured and sincere as he issued a formal apology and outlined the new initiatives the airline would implement. He spoke not only as a businessman but as a man who truly cared about people, especially his own grandson. During one press conference, James addressed the gathered media with a calm but firm voice. "We have learned a lot from this incident," he stated, "and while we cannot undo the harm that has been done, we are committed to taking every necessary step to ensure that no passenger ever feels the isolation and indignity that Calvin experienced. The work begins today, and we will be accountable at every step." Calvin stood by his side, his presence a powerful reminder that the change they sought was not just for him, but for all those who had been marginalized by biased systems. Although the attention was overwhelming and the spotlight was not something he had ever sought, he recognized that his voice now had the power to catalyze change. Later that week, the airline began rolling out the promised reforms. Sensitivity training sessions were scheduled, internal policies were overhauled, and a third-party audit was launched to evaluate every customer interaction. Despite the flurry of activity, Calvin knew that real change would require time and persistent effort. He often found himself reflecting on the painful memories of that day, the cold dismissal by Lydia, the feeling of being undeserving simply because of his appearance, and he vowed never to let those experiences define him. Instead, he resolved to use them as fuel to drive the movement for fairness forward. One afternoon, as he sat with James in the spacious living room of their family home, a place filled with understated American elegance and the soft glow of afternoon light, Calvin expressed his deepest concerns. "Grandpa, I still worry," he admitted quietly, "about whether all this will really change things. What if the company just makes promises and then goes back to the way things were?" James looked at him with a calm intensity that belied his gentle exterior. "Change does not happen overnight," he said firmly, "but every step we take, every promise we keep, brings us closer to a future where no one is made to feel less than they are. We have to keep pushing until our voices are not just heard but acted upon." His words, imbued with both wisdom and determination, reassured Calvin and reinforced his own resolve. As the days turned into weeks, the progress made by the airline continued to be scrutinized and celebrated. Calvin's story remained at the forefront of discussions on corporate accountability, and his journey from victim to advocate served as a powerful symbol of resilience. Even though the memories of that fateful flight and the unkindness of Lydia would never fully fade, they had paved the way for a movement that promised to make a difference for countless others. In the end, the battle for change was far from over. It was a long, ongoing process that demanded unwavering commitment and the courage to confront injustice at every turn. Calvin knew that there would be setbacks and challenges ahead, but with his grandfather by his side and a growing community of supporters rallying behind them, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The incident that had once filled him with shame and despair had transformed into a catalyst for hope, a reminder that even the most painful experiences can lead to a brighter, more inclusive future. And as he looked ahead, Calvin carried with him the unshakable belief that real change was not just possible but inevitable, so long as people like him continued to stand up and speak out for what was right. Calvin's journey toward justice had reached a pivotal moment that day. After months of enduring the cruelty of a biased flight attendant who had singled him out simply because he did not look the part of a first-class passenger, his grandfather, James, had taken decisive action. Now, in a sleek, modern boardroom at the airline's headquarters, James was leading a meeting with the company's top executives. He wasn't interested in superficial fixes or empty promises. He demanded meaningful, lasting change that would alter the very fabric of the company. Standing at the head of the table, James asked in a calm but forceful tone, "Are we prepared to make these changes permanent? Because if we aren't, then we're just wasting everyone's time." The room fell silent for a moment before one of the executives finally spoke up, assuring him that the board understood the gravity of the issue and was committed to making the necessary changes. James's unwavering commitment left no room for ambiguity. "We will measure progress with monthly updates, employee feedback, and customer satisfaction surveys. We're going to hold everyone accountable," he declared. Calvin, seated quietly near the front, could feel the tension in the room as if it were a physical force. He remembered all too vividly the humiliating moment on the plane when Lydia, the callous flight attendant, had treated him with such cruelty. Her cold, unyielding dismissal based solely on his appearance had left him feeling exposed and devalued. Now, hearing his grandfather's words, he felt both a surge of hope and a renewed determination to see this injustice eradicated for good. As the meeting drew to a close, James stood and shook hands with each board member, his presence still commanding respect even as the discussions wrapped up. Calvin watched as the executives slowly dispersed, their faces a mixture of satisfaction, unease, and deep contemplation. Some looked relieved that change was finally on the horizon, while others seemed to be wrestling with the reality that they, too, had contributed to a broken system. James turned toward Calvin, his eyes softening just a bit. "We're making progress, but it's only the beginning. We have to ensure this momentum stays on track," he said quietly. Later that afternoon, in the privacy of a modest hotel suite provided by the company, Calvin sat with his grandfather and allowed himself to absorb the weight of the day's events. He felt proud of the way James had handled the meeting, so forceful and calm at the same time, but he also felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the task ahead. He recalled how Lydia's actions on that flight were not just an isolated incident, but a symptom of a deep-seated culture of prejudice. It wasn't enough to have the board promise change. It would take years of effort to transform the underlying values of the airline. "You've done a lot already, but how do we make sure people remember this? How do we ensure these changes don't just fade away?" Calvin asked softly, his voice betraying a mix of hope and apprehension. James offered him a small, knowing smile. "We keep talking about it, we keep pushing, and when the time is right, we'll make sure everyone understands what happened here, why it matters. This isn't just about one mistake. It's about how every person is treated every single day. It's about accountability." His words were not only a promise, but a call to action, reinforcing the idea that real change was a long, hard road that required persistence and unity. The meeting had been a turning point for the entire company. In the days that followed, the airline launched new diversity and inclusion policies and began rolling out mandatory sensitivity training for all employees. Every department was now under scrutiny, and the company had even commissioned a third-party audit of its customer-facing staff. The media had caught wind of the incident, and soon, Calvin's mistreatment became a nationwide topic of discussion. The hashtag proclaiming that no one should be treated like this trended on social media, and people from all walks of life shared their own experiences of unfair treatment. Although the attention was overwhelming for a young man who had once been so painfully invisible, Calvin felt a sense of vindication. His suffering was no longer a solitary burden. It had sparked a movement. During one press conference, James addressed a room full of reporters with a measured tone that exuded both authority and compassion. "We have learned a great deal from this incident," he said, "and while we cannot undo the harm that has been done, we are committed to making lasting changes. The work begins today, and we will be accountable every step of the way." Calvin stood beside him, his presence a quiet reminder that the change being promised was deeply personal as well as broadly impactful. Despite the harsh spotlight of the media, Calvin's heart swelled with a newfound strength. He was no longer the quiet boy who had been humiliated on a flight. He was now a catalyst for change, a symbol of resilience in the face of cruelty. Over the following weeks, the internal reforms within the airline began to show tangible progress. Employees started to speak more openly about the importance of diversity and inclusion, and passengers began to notice a subtle but significant shift in the way they were treated. The board held follow-up meetings, and James demanded regular progress reports to ensure that the new policies were not merely words on paper. "We're not just going to apologize and move on," he reiterated during one such meeting. "We are going to change the way we operate from the ground up." His voice was low but resolute as he outlined plans for continuous improvement. Plans that included monthly feedback sessions and rigorous accountability measures for every employee who interacted with customers. Calvin observed all of this with a mix of admiration and quiet determination. He had learned from his grandfather that change wasn't instantaneous. It required relentless effort and the courage to keep fighting even when progress was slow. In one particularly moving conversation in his grandfather's office, surrounded by scattered papers and notes on policy changes, Calvin confessed, "Grandpa, I want to help. I don't want this to be just a moment that fades away. I want people to remember that no one should ever be treated the way I was." James smiled, his eyes reflecting years of hard-won wisdom. "That's exactly why this matters, Calvin. Change happens when people like you stand up and make your voices heard. You don't have to be an adult to make a difference. You've already shown that you can." As months turned into a season of transformation, the airline's renewed commitment to fairness and respect began to permeate every level of the organization. The board's public statements, the new training sessions, and even the third-party audits were not mere band-aids on a broken system. They were the first steps toward a lasting cultural shift. Calvin, once a victim of thoughtless cruelty by someone like Lydia, now used his voice in meetings and public forums to advocate for those who might otherwise be overlooked. His journey had changed him from a quiet, frightened boy into a determined young advocate who understood the true meaning of justice. One memorable evening at a public event celebrating the new policies, James stood at the forefront while Calvin gathered his courage to speak. With a clear and steady voice, Calvin addressed the room. "Today isn't just about our company. It's about every single person who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. No one should ever feel out of place simply because of how they look. I've learned that if you want things to change, you have to be the one to make it happen." The room fell silent as his words resonated deeply with everyone present. It was a moment of raw authenticity, a moment where the scars of the past met the hope of a better future. In the months that followed, James continued to monitor the progress closely. He pushed for further improvements in employee conduct and policy implementation, always demanding transparency and accountability. Calvin found himself increasingly involved in this process. He attended meetings, offered suggestions, and even coordinated with employee groups to ensure that the changes would be both meaningful and enduring. Despite the many challenges and the occasional setback, the momentum was undeniable. The company was no longer a bastion of outdated practices. It was evolving into an organization that truly valued every customer, regardless of their background. Late one afternoon, as Calvin and his grandfather sat together in the quiet of their family residence, a home that epitomized understated American elegance, James turned to him and said, "I'm proud of you, Calvin. You've helped ensure that this moment isn't just a fleeting headline. You've sparked a movement that will remind everyone that fairness and respect must always be at the core of what we do." Calvin's heart swelled with pride as he replied, "I couldn't have done it without you, Grandpa." It was a tender moment of recognition, a moment that sealed their bond as both family and as fighters for justice. The road ahead was long, and both Calvin and James knew that real change would require ongoing effort. Yet as they looked back on the progress made, from that painful day on the plane to the sweeping reforms now taking shape, they felt hopeful. They understood that every step, every meeting, and every challenge overcome was a victory for all those who had ever suffered from discrimination. And even though the memory of Lydia's unyielding cruelty would always be a part of Calvin's past, it had also become the catalyst for a future where every person could feel safe, respected, and truly valued. Calvin felt a renewed sense of purpose as he sat with his grandfather James, reading a letter from the board that praised their unwavering commitment to change. The letter acknowledged that the transformation they had inspired was now a model for inclusivity. Although Lydia's ruthless cruelty had once left Calvin feeling small and humiliated, that injustice had ignited a fierce resolve within him. Now, as he helped shape the company's future, he understood that he was not merely a witness, but a force in history. With his grandfather's guidance, Calvin vowed to keep fighting for respect and dignity for all.